Westward Expansion by Tammy Zambo. The Promise of the Louisiana Purchase. In the history of the United States, perhaps no period is more fascinating to modern-day Americans than the age of expansion into the American West. In 1804, President Thomas Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to explore the vast area known as the Louisiana Purchase, a new United States territory bought from France. Until then, Americans had branched out only as far west as the Mississippi River. Lewis and Clark's expedition, however, instantly captured the imagination and interest of Americans in all 17 existing states. Many of them soon grew so curious that they became determined to learn for themselves what delights lay in that mysterious western land. Even before Lewis and Clark returned to the east to report on all they had seen and done, a few adventurous people, virtually all men, set out to make their living as beaver trappers in the West. These brave, hardy souls were known as mountain men, and some of them, such as Jim Bridger and Jim Beckworth, became famous. The mountain men explored and charted trails as they moved from stream to stream in search of beavers. It was these trails that other Americans soon followed as they too moved west. Pioneers on the move. By 1840, the beaver population had declined, and some of the mountain men returned to the east. Some, however, found other work, such as guiding pioneers over the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada on their way to California or Oregon Territory. In the 1840s, the United States welcomed Texas as the 28th state. It also claimed territory from the British that spanned Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. As a result of the Mexican War, the United States also won lands that included California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. These new regions were appealing to Easterners. More and more Americans headed west in search of exciting new lives. The Pioneers' Caravans. Most of the pioneers traveled along trusted trails. Supplied with covered wagons, teams of oxen, and several months' worth of food and supplies, families would gather in the spring in Omaha, Nebraska, or Independence, Missouri, to form a wagon train. Then they started their journey, their wagons moving single file in one long caravan. Many followed the Overland Trail, which later split into other trails that included the Oregon and California trails. Some pioneers took the Santa Fe Trail into the Southwest. Most family members, including children, walked alongside their wagon during the day, driving cattle and other livestock. They hunted game, such as buffalo, elk, and deer along parts of the trail. Their cows provided fresh milk. A churn attached to the wagon made butter as the wagon lurched along. The journey west was long, difficult, and dangerous. Wagon trains plodded along at about 2 miles an hour, and the pioneers headed toward Oregon Territory were on the 2,000-mile trail for about 5 months. Bad weather and rough trail conditions caused many problems. Illness was another constant threat, and graves dotted every trail. A large 2-parent family starting out on the trip might be diminished to a few orphaned children by the time the wagons reached Oregon. A find in California. In January 1848, a work crew was building a sawmill on the American River in California when a crew member spotted something shining in the ground. It was a nugget of gold, about half the size of a pea. That small find would change the West forever. Word spread quickly that gold had been discovered, and soon people all over the region dropped whatever they were doing and headed for the California gold fields. When many of them also found gold, people from back east and all over the world began to catch gold fever. A large number of people immigrated to California in 1849, which earned them the name 49ers. In no time at all, San Francisco and other booming cities in the area were home to the most diverse population of people in the world. There were European Americans, African Americans, both enslaved and free, and Native Americans. They came from the East Coast, particularly New England, China, Germany, Ireland, Russia, Italy, the West Indies, and Australia. Less than 10% of them were women. With only a pick and a pan. Getting to California was a challenge for 49ers from the eastern states. Most of them took the land route and traveled by covered wagon. Some, however, traveled by sea along one of two routes. One route took them 18,000 nautical miles south through the Atlantic Ocean, all the way around the tip of South America and north again through the Pacific Ocean. The other route was much shorter, going from the east coast to Panama, but it involved crossing an isthmus, or narrow strip of land, by mule and canoe to the Pacific side with the added risk of contracting tropical diseases along the way. For a few years, there was plenty of gold to be found through placer mining. This method involved no more than a pick, shovel, or pan because the gold was on or near the surface of the soil, especially along streams. By 1852, though, this surface gold was virtually gone. Investors took over the gold fields and set up mining companies. They introduced sophisticated machinery to extract more gold by drilling deep shafts into the ground or by blasting into hillsides. Some 49ers stayed in California and worked for the new mining companies, this time for a paycheck. Others headed home, searching for gold along the way. Some of these prospectors were lucky. Significant gold deposits were found in present-day Colorado, and the city of Denver sprang up as a result. Gold was also found in areas that are now in Montana, Oregon, New Mexico, Arizona, and Nevada. The Pony Express. The thousands upon thousands of people who moved to California during the gold rush were eager for news from the East and letters from family members. The mail service, however, was irregular and could take months to arrive. The homesick immigrants began to demand faster and more reliable service. Three entrepreneurs, William Russell, Alexander Majors, and William Waddell, operated a successful freight service across the West, hauling supplies to settlers and military posts in long wagon trains. The three men soon came up with a daring new plan. They would set up a 2,000-mile route that experienced horse riders would travel to transport mail in relay fashion in 10 days or less. Their service, the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company, began on April 3, 1860, and quickly became known as the Pony Express. It was outfitted with fine, sturdy horses and 80 riders, men and boys, who weighed an average of between 100 and 120 pounds and knew the frontier well. Each rider carried a mail bag called a mochila draped over the saddle. Because the riders needed to travel speedily, the mail could weigh no more than 10 pounds. A half-ounce letter initially cost $5 in gold to mail, about $100 today, and letters and newspapers were printed on thin tissue paper. The mochila was never allowed to stop on its route, regardless of weather or time of day or night. Each rider traveled between 75 and 100 miles between relay stations, and 2 minutes was allowed every 10 to 15 miles for changing horses. If somehow a horse was lost or killed along the way, its rider had to carry the mochila on foot to the next relay station. It was not uncommon for a rider to arrive at a relay station only to find no rider there to relieve him. When this happened, the rider, and sometimes the same horse, would press on to the next station, and often the one after that. One rider braved a blizzard and sub-zero temperatures for more than 36 hours and covered 160 miles before a fresh rider could take over. The telegraph conquers the West. The Pony Express operated for only about 18 months. Developing technology in the form of the telegraph made it obsolete. The telegraph transmitted messages electrically along wires and accomplished in mere minutes what the Pony Express did in 10 days. The telegraph had already been in use in the East, and on October 24, 1861, the extension of telegraph lines to the West Coast was complete. 2 days later, California newspapers noted that our little friend the pony is to run no more. The Long Drive. Even before Americans began heading to the territories of the far West, thousands of them settled in Texas and established cattle ranches. This region was perfect for raising cattle because the wide-open terrain provided plenty of room for grazing. Ranchers had a problem, though, as they raised far more cattle than they could sell locally. They soon set about finding new markets. Easterners liked beef and wanted to buy it, but getting the cattle to the nearest eastern market, over 1,000 miles away, was very difficult. In the West, though, cattle could be driven in herds to new markets across the plains. The California Gold Rush was a prime opportunity for Texas ranchers because the large numbers of 49ers demanded more beef than local ranchers could supply. Despite the long distance, during the 1850s, more than 100,000 cattle were driven in herds from Texas to San Francisco. The heyday of cattle driving came after the Civil War, as the eastern railroads began branching farther west. Cattle could now be driven north from Texas to towns such as Sedalia and Dodge City, Missouri, and Abilene, Kansas. There, the cattle would be loaded into rail cars bound for Chicago, Illinois, the center of the meatpacking industry. Cattle drives were usually conducted by teams of cowboys rather than ranchers themselves. A team, or outfit, was made up of a trail boss and 8 to 10 cowboys for a herd of between 2,000 and 3,000 cattle. An outfit also had a cook who drove the chuck wagon, and a wrangler who took care of the horses the cowboys rode. Most cowboys were European American, but Mexican and African American cowboys were not uncommon. Keeping the cattle calm and headed in the right direction was the cowboy's primary duty. The cattle, however, were skittish and could stampede at the slightest sound or unexpected movement. They panicked easily while crossing rivers, too, and could begin to mill or move in a tight circle until those in the center went under. Cowboys needed to break up stampedes and mills, along with tracking down strays and coaxing stragglers. They took turns keeping watch through the night, too, and they got little sleep. After months on the trail, an outfit reached its destination, and the cowboys could get a bath and a new set of clothes. Ranches across the prairie. Between the end of the Civil War and 1890, about 10 million cattle were driven north from Texas. The long cattle drives gradually came to an end as the open range was fenced off. Ranchers began to spread north into the prairies of Nebraska, North and South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana. Cattle drives shortened to a few days rather than months. The biggest adjustment for cowboys was getting used to the cold and snowy winters. While on the trail, they had to find grazing areas where the wind had blown away the snow and cut holes in the ice so the cattle could get water to drink. Sunlight on the snow was blinding and caused the cowboys to get sunburned. Frost cracked their lips and skin. The glory days of the cowboy were over. The Transcontinental Railroad. Before the Civil War, settlers west of the Missouri River began demanding that the railroad be extended to the west coast. A transcontinental railroad was a huge undertaking. Lawmakers in Congress authorized the railroad in 1862, and two companies began to build it in 1863 from opposite ends of the country. The Union Pacific, employing 10,000 men, worked its way west from Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific, with 11,000 workers, worked eastward from Sacramento, California. The height of the Civil War interrupted construction, but it resumed with even more intensity once the war was over. Each crew faced immense challenges. Union Pacific workers were attacked by Native Americans who resented the intrusion onto the land they controlled. Central Pacific workers had to blast 15 tunnels through the mountains of the Sierra Nevada, a very dangerous job. The railroad workers, however, were persistent. The Union Pacific employed mostly immigrants from Ireland, but there were also former Confederate soldiers, Mexicans, Germans, English, and formerly enslaved African Americans. The Central Pacific hired thousands of Chinese who had initially immigrated to search for gold in California. Each crew raced to see who could lay track over the most ground. The promise of a homestead. A new period of settlement by pioneers began in 1862 when Congress passed the Homestead Act. This act provided that any person who claimed a plot of public land or homestead on the Great Plains and farmed it for 5 years would be given 160 acres. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 attracted settlers farther west, and farms sprang up all across the Midwest. Nearly 2 million people moved to the plains in the 1870s and worked tirelessly to establish their farms. The homesteaders built their houses themselves out of the very sod of the earth. They plowed their fields and either dug wells or walked daily to nearby streams for water. They hoped for favorable weather to provide them with strong crops, and they started over again when grasshoppers, hail, or drought destroyed the crops. They tended to themselves and each other in sickness, and lent a hand when families among them were in need. Some women became self-taught midwives, helping other women during pregnancy and childbirth. In short, their lives were hard, but they did everything they could do to survive and even thrive. Settlers and the environment. However, the American pioneer expansion into the West left scars on the environment. In the 1860s, the 30 million or so buffalo that had roamed the plains were cut down drastically because they competed with the pioneers' livestock for grassland. They were increasingly hunted for their meat and their hides. As railroads snaked west, more and more people hunted buffalo simply for sport, and making leather from buffalo hides became a big business. In one 2-year period in Kansas alone, between 1.5 million and 3 million buffalo were killed. The land, too, suffered. After California's surface gold disappeared, methods such as hydraulic mining were used to tear riverbeds apart in search of more gold. By the 1860s, people could see that hydraulic mining was destroying the rivers, but it took decades to put a stop to the practice. A European, James Bryce, wrote about destruction such as this: "Why, in your hurry to subdue and utilize nature, squander, waste her splendid gifts?" Luckily, there were Americans just as concerned as James Bryce. In 1872, Congress created the world's first national park, Yellowstone National Park, to preserve the beauty that generations of travelers through that area had witnessed. In 1892, John Muir and other environmentalists formed the Sierra Club to preserve the Yosemite Valley and the surrounding Sierra Nevada. Other national parks soon followed.